After Empress Matilda had her crown usurped in the 12th century, it would be 400 years before the issue of a female queen was raised again. But the next woman to be put forward as Queen of England would hold the position for just 9 days. That young woman was Lady Jane Grey, who has been portrayed in history as an innocent, naive pawn who was pushed unwillingly into her place as queen. However, modern historians now believe she was an intelligent, politically aware participant in her fate, who understood the power she would wield had her queenship been successful. This video looks at her early life and the events that catapulted her from quiet noble to Queen of England. It's now assumed Jane was born sometime in May 1537, either in one of her parents' properties in London or her mother's house at Bradgate Manor in Leicestershire. She had a very royal lineage behind her. Her mother Frances was the daughter of Mary, Duchess of Sussex, the sister of Henry VIII. Her father, Henry Grey, the 1st Duke of Suffolk, was the great-grandson of Elizabeth Woodville through his grandfather. But she was not an only child, and she had 2 younger sisters, Lady Katherine and Lady Mary. The sisters were great-granddaughters of Henry VII, grandnieces of Henry VIII, and first cousins once removed of Edward VI, Mary and Elizabeth. Her parents' marriage had been convenient for them both. Her father gained material and political advantages, and her mother's family married into a family well favoured by Henry for helping to annul his first marriage to Katherine of Aragon. Jane would begin her education in her early years. She was lucky to be born in a brief period of Tudor history when it was fashionable to educate daughters as well as sons, something that would later waver. She would first have to learn the householding skills of sewing, embroidery and cooking. Even noblewomen were expected, due to being female, to be able to create something culinary such as jam or preserves, or to sew items of clothing to give as gifts. But alongside this, Jane would learn reading, writing and mathematics to start with, going to learn French and Italian once she mastered writing English, and when she was 8, went on to complete Latin and Greek. Her tutor for these was John Aylmer, a brilliant academic who had graduated from Cambridge University. Jane excelled in her lessons, more interested in academic pursuits over anything else. Learning Latin and Greek had another purpose, of course. Learning these 2 languages allowed moral and religious beliefs to be instilled as early as possible in the children of the well-to-do, by being able to read the Bible in both medieval Latin and earlier Greek texts. However, which side of the religious fence someone came down on was still a sensitive and sometimes deadly area of debate. Divisions were clear even after Henry VIII's Reformation, not just from those who were Catholics, but even amongst the newly formed Protestants. Some adhered to the new beliefs, but wanted to retain conservative values from the Catholic faith, while others saw it as a confirmation for more radical changes. The Grey family definitely came down on the more evangelical side, raising their daughters as part of the first generation of radical Protestants. In 1546, Jane had her first taste of court. Her mother was a lady of the Privy Chamber to Katherine Parr, the 6th and final wife of Henry VIII, and it gave her the perfect position in which to prepare Jane for her future role in serving the Queen. The Tudor court would have been a vibrant, bustling place, but it also held hidden meanings behind every smile, and court gossip was whispered in every corridor. By the time Jane came to court, Henry VIII was now an old man riddled with gout and jousting injuries, often spending days lying in his bed while pus from the wounds in his legs was dealt with by royal physicians. Katherine Parr, by contrast, was a youthful queen only in her early 30s, but who had experience of looking after ailing, aging husbands, having already been widowed twice. It wasn't long after Jane came to court that Henry VIII died in January 1547, and he was succeeded by his 9-year-old son and Jane's cousin, Edward VI. Just a few years before he died, Henry VIII had passed the third act of succession. This ensured that his son Edward VI came first in the line of succession, followed by any children he might have had with Katherine Parr, and finally, his daughters Mary and Elizabeth. In the outcome that all his children died, Henry decided the crown would then pass to those descendants of his younger sister Mary, Jane's grandmother, rather than his older sister, Margaret of Scotland. This put Jane and her sisters in the direct line for succession, a dangerous position later on. A few months later, Jane was sent to live with Thomas Seymour as his ward. He was the younger brother of the new Protector of England, Edward Seymour, and he was ambitious. Not only did he woo Katherine Parr and marry her not long after she became a widow for the third time, and was also given care of Elizabeth, her stepdaughter, but he also saw he could manipulate Elizabeth and Jane for his own ends. Jane was close to Edward VI, and if she married him, it would slow down Thomas Seymour's older brother's power, of which he was jealous. Although Jane's father was not on good terms with Edward Seymour, his daughter was only 10 years old, and at first he was hesitant, but he was soon convinced of his future position. Jane enjoyed the freedom this new chapter of her life gave her, despite her age. Not only that, but she would have found herself in a household of equals. While Princess Elizabeth did not grow close to her, she was regardless another intelligent young woman who shared the household with Jane, even if she preferred her own company. And Katherine was not only clever, but deeply religious as well, studying and promoting church reform. This can only have served to encourage Jane's academic pursuits and her own evangelical fervour. But this happy situation was not to last. In September 1548, Katherine gave birth to a healthy baby girl. However, she also succumbed to a fever after childbirth, a deadly but not uncommon occurrence in a world before modern medicine. Jane was just 11, but she was asked by Thomas Seymour to be the lead mourner for Katherine's funeral. She performed this role to the letter, cutting a small but dignified figure as she led the procession to the chapel at Sudley, where Katherine's service was to be held. This was a significant funeral service, as the first Protestant funeral for a former royal queen. The service, spoken entirely in English without the trappings of Catholicism. Afterwards, she returned home, but understanding even in his grief the political pawn he would be giving up, Thomas Seymour wrote to Jane's father to ask for her to return as his ward. With the lack of a female presence in Seymour's household with Katherine's passing, and Thomas Seymour's fall in society now he was no longer her wife, Jane's parents were initially nervous in letting her go again, but eventually they did, lured by the repeated promises to match her hand in marriage to the king, Edward. It would be a grave error. This was not the adoptive home she had known a few months earlier. Seymour had taken his wife's death hard and was having a difficult time letting her memory go. At the same time, there were rumours that he wished to marry again, either to Princess Mary or possibly even to his young ward, Jane. Other rumours still whispered that he wanted to ask for Princess Elizabeth's hand in marriage. This alarmed many people surrounding Elizabeth, especially when Seymour discussed it more deeply with some members of her household. He was warned against his designs on marrying the princess by friends, but it fell on deaf ears. So certain was he that he could persuade Parliament to give him the governorship of the king's person over his brother, who was falling out of favour with many. Unfortunately for him, Sir William Sharrington, who was in charge of the Royal Mint and had been committing fraud for years and had been blackmailed by Seymour on this, was finally caught in the act. To prevent punishment for himself, he gave up all the information he knew on Seymour's plans to marry the Princess Elizabeth, Others gave up rumours of what he had said over past months about rounding up people in favour of the king and against his brother. Finally, a bill was passed charging him with high treason. On the 20th of March, 1549, he was taken to Tower Hill to be beheaded. Jane returned home, a mix of emotions. She had seen the death of people she came to view as an extended family, Katherine Parr, Thomas Seymour, and even their baby. But the experience also taught her to reflect more on her faith and to correct behaviour that might not be pleasing to God. In other words, she went deeper into being a Protestant. Henry Grey, Jane's father, was incredibly lucky to avoid serious punishment. He had remained a steadfast friend to Seymour throughout the whole affair, and gone so far as to say he would defend him against everyone but the king. He was interrogated on at least 4 occasions, but passed them, perhaps because despite his lack of judgment in becoming so close to Thomas Seymour, he had no direct hand in the plot for his friend to marry Elizabeth. Attention was now turned back to Jane and the proposition of who she should marry. With no more plotting from Thomas Seymour, there was no more question of her marrying the young King Edward. Instead, it was proposed that she should marry Edward Seymour, the younger son of the elder Edward Seymour, protector of the king. However, nothing came of this, and the idea was rejected both by Jane's step-grandmother Katherine Suffolk on the grounds of her not liking child marriages, and of John Dudley, then Earl of Warwick, as he had his own plans for her. Later in 1549, her father was elected to the Privy Council, along with new titles and lands that brought him increased wealth, straining relations with their mother's cousin, the Princess Mary, who was a publicly staunch Catholic. This situation became more dangerous for Mary, as Henry Grey wasted no time in expelling conservative nobles from the Privy Council, and this must have caused some difficulties between the Greys and Mary, although they did keep open the channels of communication. Politics in Tudor times meant keeping your options open, as everything could change quickly. By this point, Jane was excelling in all things she was taught, from her music and dancing to her Greek and Latin. However, she complained to her former tutor Roger Ascham that her life was made miserable by her parents' desire for her to be perfect in all ways, in that if she didn't behave in a manner which they thought should match her station, she was punished with pinches, nips and bobs, and other ways. While this statement was later used by Ascham to support his ideas that pupils should be treated kindly, it has been misrepresented throughout history to portray Jane's parents as needlessly cruel. However, the strict upbringing she had would have been the norm among her noble peers, and a letter written by Ascham just a few months later stated how proud her parents were of her achievements. The education Jane's father had paid for was normally reserved only for sons, but her parents chose to do this instead for their daughters. Naturally, this was a rigorous schedule, and unlikely to have been viewed adoringly by a teenage girl. In 1553, Jane Grey was finally betrothed to Lord Guildford Dudley, the 4th son of John Dudley, now styled the Duke of Northumberland. As a 4th son, Guildford had little reason to expect such a prestigious match, but the political implications of those around him made it happen. For the previous 2 years, King Edward had fought off various illnesses, and during a slight recovery, he wrote a will. Within it, he swept aside his sisters in line for the throne, and the Stuart line, as his father had done. Due to his evangelical tutoring, he believed that a ruling woman would be against the divine order of society, declaring that in the case of not having an heir himself, the crown was to pass to the male heirs of Lady Frances Grey. After her, it would fall to the male heirs of Jane, her sisters Katherine and Mary, and their cousin Mary Clifford in that order. However, Francis did not look likely to have any more children, and so it fell to the next generation to be married off and producing possible heirs. The Duke of Northumberland reportedly had to use threats and coercion to get Jane's parents to agree to the match, and even then, there were rumours that Jane herself was less than thrilled. She must have heard the talk about her becoming married to the king, and now she was being downgraded to a boy who was in line to inherit nothing after his 3 older brothers. There was a triple wedding on the 25th of March 1553, held at Durham House, the London residence of the Duke of Northumberland. The first couple were Lady Jane Grey and Northumberland's son, Lord Guildford Dudley. Next was her sister Katherine, just 12 years old, married to Henry Herbert, in line for his father's title of Earl of Pembroke. The third marriage was that of Catherine Dudley, Guildford's younger sister, who was married to Henry Hastings, heir of the Earl of Huntingdon. The occasion was a happy one, with much feasting, dancing and jousting tournaments for entertainment, but everyone could see the 3 marriages for what they were, political matches, to shore up support both for the Greys and the Duke of Northumberland. On the 28th of May 1553, the Duke of Northumberland was privately told by Edward's doctors that the teenage king did not have long to live. Edward himself redrew his will, making small but important changes that would create such chaos after his death. Where before he had simply left his crown to the so far non-existent male heirs of the Grey ladies, he inserted 2 words which would change this. Where before he had written Lady Jane, heirs male, now it read Lady Jane and her heirs male. This meant that now Jane was officially the next in line for the English throne, followed by her male heirs. Her mother Frances, not pregnant nor likely to be, was effectively written out of the line of succession, the same as Henry VIII had decided to do. Northumberland possibly had much to do with this decision, now his son was Jane's husband. Later sources state that it was Northumberland himself who told Jane that she was now the young king's heir, and apparently she was stunned and deeply upset. The news initially caused some upset between the 2 families, as Jane made her way back to her parents' home to tell them, and they were furious that Frances had been ruled out of the succession and suspected John Dudley was planning to crown his son Guildford through Jane. While Jane was comforted, the Duchess of Northumberland, Jane Guildford, threatened to keep Guildford with her and cause a scandal by the barely married couple being apart. But there was no point in the 2 families, who needed so much from each other and were now joined through marriage, bickering. Not long after, the young couple were reconciled, residing at Chelsea Manor, Catherine Parr's old home, which had been granted to Northumberland by King Edward. Meanwhile, Edward VI was growing ever closer to the moment of death. He requested Parliament ratify his will, offering pardons for anyone who might commit treason by following his wishes. While a few judges refused to agree to the new will, the majority of 14 did, and so it was passed. However, there was some anxiety that without the Act of Succession of 1544 being revoked, this would be a stumbling block later on. Frances Grey was summoned to the king's bedside, presumably to agree to being passed over for her daughter. Finally, on the 21st of June, the final legal document was drawn up, and the nobles and officials present would be expected to sign it. Edward explained pushing his 2 sisters out of the inheritance for the crown by declaring they were only his half-sisters, were considered illegitimate, and could marry foreign men. By contrast, Jane and her siblings were born in England, had married Englishmen, and had been brought up with the same heavily evangelical Protestant upbringing that Edward himself had. As July grew closer and Edward grew ever weaker, his sister Princess Mary came to see him, but warned that she could be seized on the way, She changed her route and fled to her estates in Norfolk and Suffolk, where she was popular and would be able to draw support to her cause. She would also be in a better position to flee abroad if it was needed. Some of the nobles were nervous about allowing Mary to remain as she was. The Duke of Northumberland was nonchalant about worrying over Mary's location, and possibly believed she would flee to Spain. He sent his son Lord Robert Dudley to go after her with a small number of men on horseback to bring her back to London, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. On the 6th of July, in the evening, the young Edward finally ended the torment he faced from his illness, uttering his last words, "Lord, have mercy upon me and take my spirit." The news was kept secret for 3 or 4 days. Northumberland especially suggested this, knowing there might be possible unrest with the news that Princess Mary was not to be, as the public would have expected, the next queen. Mary was well liked amongst much of the population, and her mother had been too. Jane was relatively unknown outside her circle of Protestant noblewomen, and the public would wonder why her mother had not come first, a woman in her mid-30s and with far more experience of politics and courtly life. On the 7th of July, the Mayor of London and the city magistrates swore an oath of allegiance to Jane as their queen, and she herself was taken to Sion, Northumberland's house in Richmond, Surrey. Mary had heard of her brother's death, but as it had still not been publicly announced, she bided her time. She would be charged with treason if she declared herself queen before he was actually dead. The next day, on the 8th of July, Northumberland and his noble supporters arrived at Sion to bend the knee to Jane and confirm she was now the Queen of England. She appeared overwhelmed and her mother was called to help calm her. Jane was still only 16 years old. The assembled nobles, including her parents and her parents-in-law, the Northumberlands, knelt and swore to defend her. Jane, unexpectedly and dramatically, threw herself to the floor and sobbed. This single act has been read as the actions of an innocent, naive girl who was overwhelmed by the events happening around her and her reluctance to take the crown. However, in a world before newspapers and advertisements, a political message was instead demonstrated theatrically, communicated through posturing or left in symbols in paintings. Jane's act of shocked reluctance was a carefully thought out act to portray the right message, that she had not sought the crown, and that she was a grudging but willing participant only in the hands of fate. This was a young woman who was renowned as being one of the most academically gifted of her time, and she had shown on more than one occasion that she was not a timid girl, such as times she had openly questioned Princess Mary's attachment to the Catholic faith. With what is known of Jane's upbringing and her personality, her sudden collapse into a naive young teenager seems more a shrewd act for public appearances than an actual change from her vehement faith and sharp instincts. As the eldest, Jane, encouraged with her lessons and religious fervour, was brought up to be an outspoken advocate of her religion, and here was an opportunity to impress it deeply on the population as Edward had started. After Jane finished weeping, she came to her feet and gave a speech to those around her, indicating more modesty for the chance fate had thrown at her feet, but also asking that God grant her such grace as to enable me to govern. Her act was innocent enough, but she fully intended to rule by her own hand, not as the puppet of others. However, the way was not clear. Jane might have had the oath of the nobles around her and the signed device of succession written by Edward on his deathbed, but she needed the support of the people. And sadly for Jane, that belonged to the princesses Mary and Elizabeth. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.